Well, this morning I get to do my first sermon series in our Beatitude sermon series for the summer, and we are halfway through the summer and the sermon series, which, can you believe it's like halfway gone already? It's been a really busy, full summer, and it's kind of nice, at least in my world, that it's starting to be a little bit less busy, and I'm really excited that I got this particular scripture. Now, I know at the very first one that Larry did, he talked a little bit about background and connections with the Sermon on the Mount. But, you know, Larry and I read different things and see things differently, and we agree with each other. But sometimes we like to share some different things. And that was a long time ago when he talked a little bit about the Sermon on the Mount and context. So I wanted to share some of the things that, when I was doing studying, that I read that I thought was interesting. You may or may not. Part of it is because today's theme is righteousness. And, you know, with the Beatitudes, originally people said there were 7. There were only 7 Beatitudes. Then it shifted to 8. And there was this idea that with 8, which remember that is our number that we're utilizing is 8, that there was a theme, that it was 2 sets of 4. The first 4 were teachings on attitude, and the second 4 teachings were on conduct. Both of those end with teachings on righteousness. Now, Larry has shared, and I agree with him, that we don't agree that any of the teachings of the Beatitudes are just about attitude. But that's sort of an interesting pairing of 4 and 4, attitude and conduct. Now, there is another school of thought that actually says there are 9 Beatitudes, 3 sets of 3, focusing on humility, justice, and peace. Now, whether or not theologians and researchers and scholars agree that there are 8 or 9, 2 sets of 4, 3 sets of 3, the one thing that they agree on is that the Beatitudes' placement in the Sermon on the Mount at the beginning of Jesus' ministry is really important. It tells us that this is the base of all of Jesus' teachings. This is everything Jesus does from this point forward goes back to the Beatitudes and the Sermon on the Mount. Well, okay, so then is the base of Jesus' teaching attitude and conduct, or is it humility, justice, and peace? Well, I'm not totally sure, and maybe it's some of all of it, but I found that conversation an interesting one that's been happening within academic circles, trying to sort out what Jesus was really talking about. Because that's what we're doing in this sermon series, is figuring out what Jesus was talking about. So shifting just a little bit, I know a lot of you have read Richard Rohr and like Richard Rohr. In his 1996 book, and I keep forgetting the title of it, I keep wanting to change it, Jesus' Plan for a New World, he talks about the importance of the Beatitudes in Jesus' teaching. And he says that in human culture throughout history and currently, you can see that when left to our own devices, humans tend to fall into 3 types of cultures. We either fall into a political culture, which is based on the manipulation of power, an economic culture, which is based on the manipulation of money, or a religious culture, which is based on the manipulation of some theory about God. All 3 of these cultures have a basis in some level of violence. But Jesus comes along and gives a different culture, teaches a different pathway, a different way of engaging. And that's based on the experience of God that can only occur when God is experienced personally. And Jesus' way of culture and way of engaging goes against every other type of culture when we're left to our own devices. And so the Sermon on the Mount and the Beatitudes are Jesus' opening passage of saying, okay, so you want to live this different culture. This is what you need to do. This is what it takes. And so when we dig into the Beatitudes, they're not super comfortable because they're not easy. Because they say, you know, that political, economic, religious culture that you're a part of, whichever one it is, yeah, you have to fight that and try and live this way. Because this is going to continue pushing all the time. And you got to stay focused over here. And that's what we're doing this summer. We're really focusing in on those pieces that Jesus says, this is what you need to do. This is how you need to be in relationship with God, to be able to live in this different way that's countercultural. And if we do it, we change ourselves and maybe the world. So being in the middle, we are at Matthew 5:6. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Okay, before I go any further, I want everyone to take just a minute. Bobby talked about righteousness before she sang. And just think for a minute what your definition is of righteousness. When you think about righteousness, what is it that comes up in your mind? And then just hang on to that. We're going to come back to righteousness and see how it meshes with what I'm talking about, because you can agree with me or disagree with me, that's fine, but just see how it meshes and see how it works in. Because I wanted to do the easy parts first, hunger and thirst and filled, because being hungry and thirsty, we understand that, right? We know what hunger and thirst is, and we know that food and water is vital and important, and without it, we're gonna die very quickly. That makes sense. When we hunger and when we thirst, it drives us to seek out what's going to keep us alive. And when we eat or we drink, we have this feeling inside of us. We're full, we feel satisfied, we feel complete. So when we're talking about food, it's pretty easy. Hunger and thirst keeps us alive, drives us to keep us alive to do what the things we need to do, eat and drink, and we feel good about it. Translate that into the Beatitude about righteousness. Okay? So when we strive, hunger and thirst, that's daily, all the time, have to pay attention to righteousness, we're going to feel good. We're going to feel satisfied. And pieces are easy. Righteousness. Righteousness, not so easy. Bobby said she looked it up. If you look it up in the dictionary, there's a lot of different definitions. I'm sure if I asked you to share what you thought about righteousness, I'd get about at least 20 different answers. But the point of this isn't our Webster's Dictionary definition of righteousness or the American definition of righteousness. Jesus is talking about biblical righteousness. And that has been debated and discussed since the beginning of time, because righteousness is talked about from Genesis through to Revelations. It's an important concept from beginning to end. And scholars don't always agree what it means. But since the Reformation, the focus on righteousness has been about spiritual connection, about God's salvation, God's spiritual saving power, which, if that's what you believe, makes this beatitude very simple, because it's about spiritual purity, which has been the focus since the Reformation. Now, I'm not saying that seeking spiritual purity is a bad thing. There is something to that. But I don't think this beatitude is that simple. I don't think anything Jesus ever said was very simple. And so I think there's more to it. So, the Greek word for righteousness, and just so you know, I'm going to butcher its pronunciation. I took Greek for preaching, not for pronouncing. I learned how to research it. So that Greek word is dikosin. The root word is dakai, and it's used 26 times in Matthew alone. That root word is also the root word of justice. So there's some connection between righteousness and justice. But what that is, we've got to figure out what Jesus was talking about, and since this is at the beginning of Jesus' teachings, we don't have a reference point of anything Jesus said or did before this, so we need to go to what he learned as a child. Now, I know that there are people in this congregation, I have heard it said, we are a New Testament church. We should not be talking a lot about the Old Testament. Well, I'm going to disagree because one, I love the Old Testament. And two, because Jesus grew up with all of those scriptures and all of his ideas and all of his teachings came from that. So we have to go to the Old Testament. And there are scholars that agree with me, most of them, that in order to understand, you have to understand the Old Testament idea of righteousness. Now, honestly, I would rather go, ooh, righteousness, justice. I love justice. I want to talk about justice. Because justice has been my passion since I was probably before I could speak, I think. Once I understood the word, that was my life was all about justice. And I would love to talk about it and point out how the other things that come later in the Sermon on the Mount support that idea that what Jesus is talking about is justice as caring for the poor, feeding the hungry, caring for the sick, visiting people in prison. Because I can get on board with that, and let me tell you, that would be an easy sermon to write, and that was the one I wanted to write. But sometimes God has other plans, and I had to fight with God a bit on this one. I read something in the Interpreter's Dictionary that I had to sit with for a while and figure out what to do with it. Because I think righteousness has something to do with spiritual purity. And I think righteousness has something to do with justice. And then, this is what the Interpreter's Dictionary says. Righteousness is not a behavior that is in accordance with any ethical, legal, psychological, religious, or spiritual norm. Okay. Neither is it a conduct that is dictated by human or divine nature. It is not an action appropriate to the attainment of a specific goal. Neither is it a ministry to one's fellow man. Okay, now I'm struggling with it. Rather, righteousness in the Old Testament is the fulfillment of the demands of a relationship, whether that relationship be with men or God. So each of these relationships brings about specific demands. The fulfillment of those demands constitutes righteousness. So there's no norm for righteousness outside of relationship. When God or man fulfills the conditions imposed by the relationship, then they're righteous. So did you hear that? Righteousness is about relationship. It's about how we interact and engage in relationship with each other and with community. Because in the Old Testament, the righteous person was the person who was working for the community as a whole, living in right relationship with everyone in the community, and honoring those relationships regardless of how messy or complicated they were. So where I landed is that righteousness within relationship is about restoring or building community through relationship in relationship. So I had to chew on that for quite a while and sort of figure out what to do with it and how that might influence my life, adding that layer into it. And so where I got to was, blessed are those who hunger and thirst. Blessed are those who focus on and strive for every day the restoration and building of community, no matter how messy or complicated the relationships get, for they will feel satisfied and complete. Whether or not that restoration building actually fully occurs does not seem to be the point. It's the focus on it, the striving towards it, and the never forgetting that that's the goal. So then my question became, what does it look like for me as an individual and for Murray Hills Christian Church as a church, as an entity? What does it look like for us to focus, for me to focus on community building, community restoration, only within the confines of relationship? Not for personal gain, not for ministry's sake, but what does that look like within relationship? And I spent some time really thinking about it, and I have some ideas, but I want to give you all a little bit of time to think about this for a minute. So I would like you to think about it. I'd like you to turn to someone in the pews who you didn't come to church with, who you don't have lunch with every day, who you aren't married to, isn't your spouse, parent, child. So that makes it a little bit more complicated. And share for just a minute what you think that might be. Something that you can do. Something that the church can do to focus on restoration or building of community only within relationship. It has to be relationally connected. So I'll give you a minute to think about it or talk about it, and then we'll come back and see if anyone wants to share. I do have a couple of things, but I will be honest, it took me a while to get to some of them. I wanted to give you more time than that, but I'm looking at the clock and we started late, and I know that, that we all have things that have to happen after church today before it gets too hot. Is there anyone that would like to share an idea that they had or that they talked about that focus on building, restoring community within relationships? Sharing stickers with friends.
Bringing back Wednesday night dinners and making it so church people get sit next to church people.
Yeah, we've got, we have the fun in the fall stuff coming back up again, which is fellowship building, and I like that, church people don't sit next to church people. What would happen if it was community and not just us? That is the top of my list that I was going to. You nailed it, Mary. That was the first one that I thought of. So being a host church for Family Promise gives us an opportunity to build some relationships with families that are struggling while they're being provided some really intentional support so that they both become and feel like they are contributing worthwhile members of the Beaverton community. I'll tell you that this year our VBS shepherds are sending notes to the kids and families that were in their group, saying how much they enjoyed getting to know them, building that relationship, which then strengthens out into Beaverton, because those families know people care and other people are connected with them. So working with children, whether you are working with the children in this church, Whether you are going to the local elementary school near you, being a star reader, whether you're getting involved with the locations that have the free reduced lunches and breakfast during the summer and building relationships with our children, strengthens our community because they are not only our present, but they are our future, both of our church and of Christianity, but really of the world. So if we work together to raise them up, I think that's working for righteousness. Ian, building off of your idea, reaching out to people that we don't know very well, maybe someone we might not really want to know very well because we're not sure we like them that much, whether it's in the church or in our neighborhood, builds that relationship. Those relationships strengthen our community. Sometimes it's as simple as standing by and with a friend, even when you disagree with the choices they're making. Hanging on to that relationship, being supportive and loving and caring through those choices because the relationship is more important than what they're doing. And then two tough ones. What about getting involved in real, honest, long-term solutions to affordable housing in Beaverton? Not temporary low-income housing so people can move out, but real solutions to affordable housing. So that our food pantry clients, guests that we have gotten to know over the years that have to keep coming back, aren't spending all of their money on rent, that they actually have money to spend on food and other things that they need. There are a lot of things that we can do as individuals and as a community, but restoration of community and the building of community is hard work. It's not something that we can think about every once in a while, and I think that's the point of the Beatitude. Because when we hunger and thirst, we're doing it all the time. It's always on our mind. It's always what we're working towards. It's what's going to bring us to satisfaction, to completion. Always on our mind, working towards something bigger and better than ourselves. Because it's not always, we'll feel filled, but we also might find maybe we change. Maybe the church changes. Maybe Beaverton changes. Maybe we impact and change the world. Will you pray with me? God, we are grateful for your presence that comforts us when we are sad, that celebrates with us when we are happy. And we are grateful for your presence that pushes us to participate in your dream. May we look out into the world and see how we can hunger and thirst to be a part of what you call us into. In Christ's name.